Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe and, of course, above all, well. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Of all the issues we've tackled on this show since its inception in March of 2020, none are more consequential and dangerous, in my view, than the subject and the issue of political violence in America. It's certainly not a new issue. It's been with us, as both Eric and Mary know, since even before the founding of the Republic. Indeed, the recent assassination of an former American president reminds us of that history. 8 of the 21 presidents elected since 1900, that's more than 2/3, have either been shot or shot at. 2 have been killed. And lest we forget the attempted assassinations of 2 sitting representatives, Gabby Gifford in 2011, in Tucson and in 2017, the attempted assassination of House Majority Whip Steve Scalise, which the FBI actually classified as an act of domestic terrorism. It's not an easy phenomenon to understand. 30 years ago, the U.S. Secret Service initiated a study which set out to analyze 83 actual or would-be assassins who acted between 1949 and 1996 in an effort to help law enforcement better understand these attacks. The study's stark conclusion was that, quote, there was no useful descriptive, demographic, or psychological profiles of American assassins, attackers, and near-lethal approachers. And still, amidst all the uncertainty, we really do need to understand this phenomenon. To ignore it is clearly, or shall we say, we ignore it at our own peril. And the reason is, I think, because of the numbers. And the numbers don't lie. Since 2015, threats against members of Congress are up tenfold, 8,000 reported last year alone. Threats against federal judges triggering investigations rose from 179 in 2019 to over 400 in 2023. And in 2024, this year, 40% of state legislators reported being threatened, attacked during the past 3 years, and nearly 90% said that they had suffered some form of abuse, stalking, or intimidation. And then, of course, we have January 6th, the first effort in our history to disrupt a peaceful transition of power. So I guess the question is, for Mary and Eric, how do we get here? First of all, is there an easy way to categorize and define political violence? How great a threat is it to the upcoming presidential election? And of course, what are the short-term solutions and longer-term solutions to help minimize or address it? And I can think of no 2 better humans on the planet to help us unpack some of these questions and perhaps guide us to some of the answers. Mary McCord, who has been on Carnegie Connects at least twice, is the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, ICAP, and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University's Law Center. Previously, Mary served as the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017, and was principal deputy assistant attorney general for national security from 2014 to 2016. Mary, welcome. Eric K. Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate, violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He brings over 3 decades of leadership in community organizing and philanthropy to Race Forward, an organization where he is now the executive vice president. He's had experience dealing with leaders from government, law enforcement, business, and civil rights in order to advance his and collective work on civil rights. He's an author much in demand, quoted just about everywhere. And I would also note that in 2021, Eric became the first American recipient of the Civil Courage Prize, first American recipient, which I might add was awarded to the late Alexei Navalny in 2023. So let's start, if we could, Mary, with you. Just sort of a basic definition. How would you define political violence, and what might fall under its rubric?
Yeah, I think it's an important first question because people use this term a lot, myself included, and sometimes we're not always clear what we're talking about. To me, and I think it's important that we look at the issue of political violence as more than actually acts of violence. I mean, you gave a lot of examples in your opening remarks of actual acts of violence, assassinations, and shootings and things like that. But political violence is such an insidious creep into our democracy and our democratic processes that I think we have to think of it more broadly. To my mind, it includes intimidation, it includes threats, it includes, in some ways, even the false narratives that provide the justification for actors to then engage in political violence, whether that's in the form of intimidation, threats, harassment, or actual acts of violence. And they do so because they can say, I'm justified in doing so because of X, Y, or Z thing that is a false narrative. That's what we saw on January 6th, right? The attackers on the Capitol, the attackers on our law enforcement, those who attempted to actually get their hands on elected officials, including the vice president, they would say they were there not only because the former president asked them to be there, but because they believed the false narrative that the election had been stolen and that Pence had the power to count illegitimate, fraudulent slates of electors and therefore declare the election to go to Mr. Trump. So it traces back to false narratives, but it's bigger than just acts of violence. And that's important because intimidation, threats, harassment, they prevent people from voting sometimes if they're not assured of their safety. They prevent people sometimes from even registering to vote. They prevent people from going to county board meetings, city council meetings, school board meetings sometimes, and they can prevent people from running for elected office. Those things all make us a weaker democracy, and so that's why I think it's important to take a broad view.
I mean, it's a critical point because if you broaden the issue of political violence beyond the physical, you really can see a sort of comprehensive threat at the rule of law, democratic participation, threats and intimidation against civil servants, public servants trying to do their job. Eric, does that seem to capture it for you as well?
It does. I mean, as we understand political violence, Mary is exactly right. It goes beyond physical attacks. It is any action, threat, or intimidation aimed at undermining democratic processes. And it can be complicated, right? Much of the political violence that we are seeing in the country today, right, are targeting individuals because of their race or religion. And so while hate violence may be a strain of this violence, we should understand that those being targeted are being targeted for political ends. At the end of the day, political violence seeks to force changes in a democratic society, small d, through the use of intimidation. It can manifest in state or extrajudicial acts, um, and through the normalization of violent ideologies that treat force as a legitimate tool for political change. For me, when violence becomes a political strategy, it attacks not only our institutions, but also the multiracial solidarity that's essential for America's functioning democracy. I think your question of how we got here, in recent years, we've seen fringe ideologies move into the mainstream, white nationalism, anti Semitic conspiracy theories, and political leaders who refuse to disavow violence. That has all contributed to this recent shift. The last piece that I would say, though, is the rise of social media has amplified these dangerous ideas, creating echo chambers where violence is not just accepted, but encouraged. According to a recent report, 1 in 10 individuals charged in connection with the January 6th attempted insurrection had military backgrounds, while 20% of law enforcement officers charged had ties to extremist groups like the Oath Keepers. I state that statistic not to just focus on the military or law enforcement, but to give those listening an understanding of how broad the normalization of political violence has shifted and moved and grown in our society. We're also facing a broader cultural shift that's reinforced where a significant portion of the population believes that violence is justified. Some polls show that nearly a third of Americans think it may be necessary to restore America's rightful leader through violent means. January 6th was a turning point. It showed us how fragile our democracy is when violence is allowed to fester unchecked. What I believe is at stake is more than just one election. For me and for Race Forward, this is a conversation about the soul of our democracy. It's not about left or right or Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal. It is about choosing whether we will live and function in an inclusive democracy or one grounded in exclusion. To do that, I think we need accountability, transparency, and a renewed commitment to nonviolence and justice for all communities across the political spectrum.
Well, you summed up a compelling mission for how to address not just political violence, but any number of other dysfunctions that currently ail our republic. I do want to get to the drivers of political violence. It's not new and why we see it manifesting itself now. But before we leave the definitional question, I came across a term. The inestimable Rachel Kleinfeld, my colleague at Carnegie, has looked at the issue of what she described as stochastic violence or stochastic terrorism. And I wonder if either of you, Mary, would you like to take a hand at trying to define it? Rachel talks about it, and I gather it was coined by a mathematician who dealt with risk analysis. Apparently it's the notion that a political leader with influence can, without being legally held responsible for incitement, talk in terms that can inspire individuals not associated with any formal organized terror group to commit an act of violence. And I think that phenomenon is sadly alive and well in our society. The dog whistling, the innuendos, the efforts to stigmatize individuals and ethnic and racial groups can inspire people to act, and statistically may actually do that.
Yes, so stochastic violence is so difficult to actually prevent because it is, by its very nature, unpredictable. It's not unpredictable that there will be violence, because when we have the false narratives, when we have elected officials in positions, people in positions of power and authority who are, I think, Eric said, refusing to denounce it, in some cases also even going so far as to encourage it, through their own memes and their own statements and their own use of terminology that, can't be interpreted as anything other than promoting violence. When you have that, we can all predict that someone is going to act upon it. The question is, how do you find that needle in the haystack? So we can prepare for things like paramilitary groups that might, offensively attack a state house or, show up at a county board meeting or even show up at an LGBTQ pride festival or a drag event, right? We can predict those things because they repeat. It's the lone actors, the individuals who oftentimes will take the action that is the most lethal. The mass shootings we've seen, for example, the most lethal, far more lethal than when a group of paramilitary actors shows up at a pride event, right? One is super lethal, the other's very intimidating, but the lethal one is actually harder to prevent. And so, that is one of the reasons, again, that the broad definition is important, because you've got to be able to trace back what are the drivers of stochastic violence and how do you address that. And that's where I think, to be honest, I think we're failing to address that adequately, in part because We have a very capacious interpretation of the First Amendment, and I'm all for the First Amendment. I litigate on First Amendment issues regularly, but not everything is protected. Yet our courts have really oftentimes taken a very broad view of what is protected. And even beyond First Amendment protection, we have, as Eric said, we have social media where it's almost anything goes. Even the biggest mainstream social media, in my opinion, do not do nearly enough to take violence-inducing content and false narratives off of their platforms. And that's just even talking about the sort of mainstream reputable platforms. We're not even talking about the platforms that don't care at all, in fact want to promote content that is violent or threatening. And it's also comes back again to the voluntary actions of people in positions of power who could do better. Right now, instead, make political choices, to go ahead and espouse and promote falsehoods that drive violence, and sometimes to even encourage violence.
Right. So our viewers and listeners, here's a perfect example. During an August 9th, 2016 campaign rally, the former president, Donald Trump, said, and I quote, "If Hillary Clinton gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks." And then he went on to say, "Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is. I don't know," unquote. So if a statement like that is left dangling with no effort on the part of responsible political figures to denounce, renounce, and push back against it, it's out there. And I think that's a classic example of what we're talking about with this notion of stochastic violence, and it's going to reoccur. So let's move on now to the drivers, what's new and what's different. Eric started the discussion. I think you might agree with the following statement, but let's see. Not since 1968, a tumultuous year marked by assassinations, including the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert RFK, urban riots, violence at the DNC, has the threat of political violence been as great as it is now? So the question, if you agree with that statement, the question is, why now? What's driving it? And how different is what we're witnessing now from the violence of the 60s and 70s, most of which were attributed to left-wing causes and actors? What's driving this? Eric?
It's a good question, Aaron. There are a number of drivers in play right now. What I'm going to do is focus on a few. So I'm going to start at the existential level in the country and in the world. We are a world that is going through rapid and significant changes in this moment. Whether we're talking about demographic change, whether we are talking about climate, whether we are talking about global inequality, the shifting of borders and contest over borders, the growth of sectarian violence around the world, the U.S. isn't immune from those same pieces. And then you couple on that a global pandemic, that COVID, which was devastating around the world. And we are a humanity that is unanchored in many ways, coupled with a shifting way that we engage and understand one another. It has left space for those who are more cynical to tap into those anxieties in order to put political formation around them. And I think I'll give an example of this by talking about demographic anxiety here in the United States. In the 80s and 90s, right, their major news outlets did their specials, their front page stories, their front covers on the browning of America, the idea that come 2050, that the country would become a majority people of color society with whites in the minority. Now, it's actually a false narrative. That's not true. The actual truth is if the Latino community continues to identify in ways that it does, the white majority will find itself in place for quite a long time in this country. But it was a narrative that was tapped into because it was a narrative that fed people's anxieties about change, particularly at the heels of the civil rights movement, which challenged our understanding of what did it mean to be an American and what will America look like. It brought a narrative of inclusion, and a growing significant proportion of white people are embracing that narrative of an inclusive multiracial society that moves us forward together. Typically, anywhere between 20 and 30% of the white population aligns itself with that vision. That may not seem like a big number, but imagine if we were talking today about how 30% of African Americans or Asian Americans were aligning themselves with the white nationalist movement, we would consider that a significant number. And so too is white America's adoption of this inclusive multiracial society that meets the needs for all. Now, that creates a power and political crisis in this country. And some have chosen to take advantage of that. With change comes anxiety. Anxiety is natural, but anxiety can also be manipulated in significant ways. It really is, I believe, the significant driver, right, to political violence in this country. And it is normalized based off of some sub drivers, which I'll mention. The historical legacy of violence. Political violence in the US has deep historical roots, from the lynchings during Jim Crow era to the assassination of civil rights leaders. And this legacy persists as an unresolved political tensions that continue to fuel acts of violence today. Political violence historically was used to maintain power and control, and it has long been a tool to suppress shifts towards justice and equality, particularly racial justice. And I think that is significant today. But also the mistrust in democratic institutions. That is also as people begin to shift their relations from being in institutions and organizations like the Shriners or the Bowling League into online networks or subcultures and fandoms like Swifties. The inability of democratic institutions to adapt to how people are framing their relationships has amplified that mistrust in democratic processes. It's driven by disinformation, as we talked about. Most recently, claims of election frauds has made violence seem like the last resort for those who feel the system no longer works for them. Right. It is this mistrust that is often stoked by political leaders and conspiracy theorists. And I want to give one more. The power of narrative and stories are very influential. One idea is this idea of conspiracy theories. The Great Replacement Theory, which falsely claims that minorities are trying to replace white Americans. The Great Replacement Theory, in short, is a retelling of an anti-Semitic narrative, a false narrative called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, that was spread in Europe in the early 1900s, that proclaimed that Jews were falsely and secretly seeking to control and destroy white Christendom. That in the United States has become known as the Great Replacement Theory. And it has led to acts of violence, from the targeting of Black grocery shoppers in Buffalo, New York, Latinos in a Walmart, Jews worshiping in Pittsburgh, and most recently in Springfield, Ohio, where the entire staff and employees of City Hall had to evacuate because of the threats that were coming in, because a political candidate chose to use the Great Replacement Theory, this false theory, in the midst of a presidential debate. The truth is that these drivers are putting organization to the natural anxiety towards change that all of us are feeling and experiencing. It's
All of that,
cynical,
all of that,
but left in a vacuum,
right?
it continues to run its course.
You've laid the foundation, I think, very well of the drivers here. Marion, let me ask you a more pointed question. In a recent article in Foreign Affairs, Professors Liliana Mason and Nathan Kamo deeply researched the issues of political violence, particularly on the right-left issue, simply argue that the right dominates in terms of the manifestation of acts of violence. They provide any number of stats since 1990 comparing violence on the right, not just in terms of inspiration and words, but in terms of deeds. Even though they found that similar numbers of Democrats and Republicans polled profess support at certain times for political violence, it's still in the single digits. So are we talking about, by and large, the mainstreaming of political violence on the right?
In many ways, I think yes. The data is kind of irrefutable in terms of lethality, at least, right. And that's been pulled together by not only Nathan Kalmo and Liliana Mason, but also other research organizations, ADL, who puts out their report every year, and SPLC and others. So the lethality is just so much greater on the right. And I would say the FBI has been pretty clear about that as well. Director Wray has been clear that when it comes to domestic extremist violence, racial and ethnically motivated violent actors, and in particular within that category, white, racially and ethnically motivated violent actors are the greatest threat, along with our sort of anti-government, militia actors, which I would say also tend to be white. So I think that's true when it comes to lethality. I do, though, I am sometimes accused of being glass half empty, but I do want to make a glass half full point here, because other types of studies, and particularly focus groups where researchers will put people from different political ideologies in a room together to talk with each other, do show that once people get face to face, they see the humanity in each other, and they end up, feeling a lot more positively about the opposing political view. That going into these meetings, they will often think, they will go not just from thinking that person's politics is different from mine and we disagree on policy. A lot of times they go into it thinking that that person and people who adhere to that political party view are evil. I mean, that's what we, because the stoking of anger through our social media and everything else has sort of got people into thinking, if I'm a Democrat, Republicans are evil. If I'm a Republican, Democrats are evil. When you put people together, they start to realize that that isn't true. And I think that's also partly what may come out in some of the polling that shows such a kind of really remarkably high level of readiness to accept violence as necessary, that you're not sitting there right then in a room with your political opponent as you're answering that. And sometimes you're also not given a specific fact scenario. You're giving a vague question, like, right? Could it ever be necessary? Well, of course, I think we'd all say at some point, maybe it would be, right? If we had a truly oppressive, repressive, authoritarian government, it might at some point be necessary. That's what historically our country, has gone.
The tree of liberty is often watered.
Right. But that's very, but when you ask a person a question and give them a specific example, would you use violence in this scenario, their views do change. So I'm not trying to take away from the fact that we should all be alarmed at some of this data, because it really is problematic. And we definitely see it translating into intimidation, threats, harassment, and even fatal and lethal acts of violence. But by far, I really believe that the vast majority of Americans don't want that. And so I think one of the things we have to really think about is, are we giving too much airtime to the minority of voices who speak the loudest about violence and therefore making it, and I promise I'm getting back to your question, making it seem more mainstreamed than it is because we spend time on it. And I plead guilty. I speak on political violence, all the time. And I'm sure, and sometimes I wonder, should I say like, nope, nothing to see here? And I don't think you can do that either, because it really does exist, and it has existed since before the founding of our country, as Eric said so eloquently. We've been a country that has had political violence and terrorism, domestic terrorism, for hundreds of years. But that doesn't mean that's what everybody wants. So I think it's time for the majority to try to really coordinate the pushback against this.
Right. I mean, effective polarization, the idea of personifying your political opponent, not on policy, but basically on humanity and moralizing. It's a morality play, good versus evil. But develop it in the real world. It's not just speculation about the Republic going down this rabbit hole or that rabbit hole. I mean, the numbers of intimidation and threats have gone up exponentially beginning over the last decade. And January 6th, I want to turn to January 6th and the DOJ prosecutions. I mean, it's the largest single case that the Justice Department has ever taken on. The investigation charging conviction and sentencing hundreds of Americans, some of whom were actually given serious prison time for their actions. The two of you are now 3 years removed from the actual event. Have any of your assessments or analysis about the significance or meaning of January 6th changed over the last 3 years? Does it seem like as great a threat, less of a threat? Eric?
It's a good question, and January 6th is still significant. So we should remember that while we are viewing these significant prosecutions, people being held to account, that there are many individuals who will never be identified from that day who were involved. We should remember, right, according to the congressional hearings that took place around January 6th, right, that there was a real belief that there may have been coordination, right, between individuals, right, who held positions in the Trump campaign, in the Trump White House, and those who belong to paramilitary organizations, some armed and unarmed. But I believe my assessment is that January 6th may have ended in DC on January 6th, but it still continues in communities around the country, both small and large, each and every day. 40% of elected officials say that they have received either threats or have been assaulted, right, due to some of the rhetoric that is being used in society right now. What January 6th did was that it normalized the idea in the United States that government can be overthrown if one does not like the outcome of democratic process.
Yeah.
That is a dangerous idea. And that idea, and small d, and that idea has not gone away, nor will it be an idea, right, according to those who study political violence, that will reside simply in the far right of America. Ideas like that grow across the political spectrum in a cycle of violence. And in that way, January 6th would significantly and perhaps forever impacts the United States.
Right.
And it intimidated too many elected officials into silence. And they have held that silence ever since.
Yeah. Mary, the DOJ prosecutions, have they had, in your view, a chilling effect at all on organized militia activity The Oath Keepers, I think we had talked, basically have gone out of business. The Three Percenters, the Proud Boys, have new militia groups formed that concern you and law enforcement?
Yeah, I think that January 6th definitely had an impact on sort of like nationwide organizations as well as nationwide movements. And I maybe have said this before on this program, Aaron, but I come back to the platform Gab a couple of years ago, post January 6th, saying, forget these national plans like January 6th, focus on your county. Then another, then maybe your state. What we need is a decentralized, localized Christian nationalist political movement. And that is what we have seen. And Eric alluded to it, is that what we've seen is that bad behavior that started in DC on this sort of massive scale has now just crept into our local communities. And it might be a paramilitary group showing up at a school board meeting and standing in the back, with their guns, or standing outside the door with their guns. It may be a paramilitary extremist group putting so much pressure on elected officials that those elected officials either decide not to run or are defeated by other more extreme candidates. And oftentimes this pressure is actually on Republican elected officials and election officials, not Democratic elected officials. And so I think it is still a threat. And when it comes to militias in particular, as you indicated, we saw sort of the disbanding of Oath Keepers at a national level, Three Percenters at a national level, even Proud Boys at a national level, in favor of local chapters, which still exists. And then you have these small sort of regional militias. They might carry the name of their county or of their city. They have no official standing. They're not authorized by state law. They're not authorized by federal law. In fact, they're unauthorized and unlawful in every state. But they want to have a banner of sort of legitimacy by using the name of their city or town. And they will claim also that they exist to engage in disaster relief and humanitarian assistance and food drives and those kind of things. And yes, they do sometimes do those things, but that is kind of a front, I would say, for what their real motive is, which is to engage in intimidation and try to push polarized communities and push toward a more extreme governing body. And also, if it favors them, to adopt the narratives of election denialism and the power to fail to certify elections and anti-immigrant false claims and all of those things. They will pick up those narratives, and then that will justify the things that they do at that local community level. So I agree entirely with Eric that it's not gone at all. It has morphed. And I don't think we will really see another January 6th type event on that scale at the Capitol, if for no other reason than the Capitol is taking measures, and law enforcement are taking much different measures than they did in the past. And the event itself, January 6th, is now a nationally designated national security event, which in my background, means all kinds of resources are brought to bear. That said, I think we certainly have the potential for lots of localized and state level political violence.
Right. I want to pick up on that point and use the time that remains to talk, if we can, about the issue of disruptions or violence in the upcoming presidential elections. We're 60 days away. Well, from what might prove to be one of the more consequential elections in American history. I don't want to catastrophize. We've gotten through 2 conventions with no disruptions, protests, but no disruptions. And as you mentioned, Mary, the DHS has designated January 6th, which is the count of the electoral vote. January 6, 2025 is the count of the electoral vote in this presidential election. And that national security event means that the Capitol now has a similar status to presidential inaugurations and conventions, right? Which should unlock all kinds of resources that the federal government can use to better coordinate and better defend. It gives me some measure of calm, Mary, that you are not predicting another January 6th. By the way, the Capitol Police Chief chief of the Capitol Police now has the authority, apparently, to request the National Guard. Now, who has to validate that request in order for the Guard to be actually deployed in case of an emergency? So I guess my general question, do either of you see significant or inexorable, inevitable challenges on election day, on the counting process, the balloting? Or will 2024, could it prove to be as secure and as safe an election as 2020? It is what happened after the election. Eric, a thought on this?
Yes, so many thoughts, and it's one of those points where I do want to turn it over to Mary and her expertise, but I will remind folks to remember, right, that leading up to January 6th were other incidences, right? There was a plot, right, to kidnap a governor, right? There was a minor insurrection that was attempted at the Oregon State House, right? There were numerous instances that led up to January 6th. And while I agree with Mary full-heartedly, we are unlikely to see a January 6th event in DC. If we do, it is a cause of great concern because it signals a different type of escalation that I don't believe we'll see. But the truth is that law enforcement, right, will likely do its job. But that is also a loss to democracy, right? So forcing law enforcement to become pure defenders of democratic process, right, is the loss of the civilian power to hold our civil society together. It's also an unfair burden, right? Law enforcement is not supposed to be a political entity. It has a role to play. It will play that role. But it's important that we don't leave it alone or to put this entire burden upon their shoulders. The truth is that political violence grows and shrinks based off of whether it perceives that it has legitimacy or illegitimacy by the larger community. So all of us have a role to play leading up to January 6th this year, which is resetting the conditions of what is acceptable behavior in our communities. And political violence is never acceptable. And we don't have to dance around that. And we need more and more civic leaders, including elected officials, to begin saying that. If we are seeing less political violence in this moment, that is because there has been a concerted effort by conservatives and liberals to come together and to begin voicing that it is an unacceptable tactic in a democratic society.
It's a powerful point, Eric. Mary, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think we also need to remember that, coming into 2022, we saw a lot of intimidation and threats, not so much on election day, but in early voting, right? At ballot boxes, outside early voting venues. And those are the things we need to watch for, because again, I don't think it's going to be necessarily a January 6th in DC, but we've got a lot of steps before that. And that's where you get that localized effect, right? Groups that decide, we have a movement again. This was thwarted in 2022, largely thwarted because of litigation that was brought. But we've seen an upsurge, an uptick in the movement toward this ballot box surveillance again, like we saw a little bit of before 2022. We've seen alliances between the so-called constitutional sheriff movement and those who are wanting to engage in this type of ballot box surveillance. And the constitutional sheriffs movement, just very briefly, is just a made-up thing by a group of sheriffs, not all sheriffs, but a group of sheriffs who claim that their role as sheriffs is sort of the preeminent law enforcement in their jurisdiction, higher even than federal government, and that the federal government can't enforce federal law in their jurisdictions over their objection. That's, of course, in violation of the Supremacy Clause. It has no basis in our Constitution or our federalism structure. But nevertheless, they have started to move into the idea of kind of involving themselves in election administration. They don't have any authority over election administration. But you pair that up with their oftentimes close ties to paramilitary actors. In fact, the founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association was also an original Oath Keepers board member. And you start to see the dangerous alliances that could form and could create turbulence and intimidation threats even before we get to election day. So I certainly, back to my glass half empty, I don't want to say we're in the clear. I think things are going to look different. And I agree with Eric that part of this is about conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, however you want to label it, all, denouncing this and being unwilling to support or look the other way and speaking out. And right now, unfortunately, the loud voices agitating for intimidation and threats have not been effectively squashed by those who are in a position to squash it. And unfortunately, one of our major presidential candidates, continues to stoke those things. I mean, some of just the recent remarks in the last few days about election officials, what he would do in terms of prosecuting election officials post-election.
I want to close with a quote by Lincoln, because I think it essence, and Lincoln was a fervent believer in this republic. This is 20 plus years before he navigated the republic through the greatest danger that any nation faced, which is civil war. But this is what Lincoln said in 1838, addressing the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield. At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. It's a cautionary, it's a warning to all of us. I believe if Lincoln had witnessed what we've been through over the last 20 plus years, I think he still would have evidenced an extraordinary faith in our institutions and the capacity of America to get through this. I fervently believe that to be the case. And with the two of you on the front lines, talking, writing, and advocating on the importance of nonviolence, on the importance of civic responsibility, I think the Republic is in very good shape. So I want to thank you, Eric Ward and Mary McCord, for coming on and sharing your perspective, and your wisdom. Thanks again. Until next time.
My pleasure.